This story is going to be difficult to hear. It's going to make many of you angry. But this is a story that has to be told. It's a story that represents what Black people have gone through in this country and, in many ways, what Black people are still going through. This is a story about injustice, brutality, pain, and abandonment. And sadly, it's a story that happened to thousands of Black people, many of whom we will never know their names. Their stories will never be told. But we do know the boy's name in this story, and it's important that we tell what happened to him, because his story represents thousands. Before I get into the story, let me give you some historical context first. This context is crucial to understand this video. It's a roadmap to understand the problem I'm going to talk about. So give me a few moments to talk about this, and then I'll get into what happened. Police brutality against Black people has long been a cornerstone of white rule in the South. Following the end of slavery and the failure of Reconstruction, it became a vital mechanism for white Southerners to reinforce white dominance and to maintain the evolving system of racial segregation in the South well into the 20th century. Southern police officers believed that physical violence was necessary to keep Black people in line, and that they were the upholders of a caste order in the South. The torture of Black prisoners and defendants was a crucial tool for preserving the segregated order of the South. By the mid-1930s, the issue of police brutality and the torture of Black people in the South began to get national attention. One of the reasons for this was the NAACP's campaign against the use of mob violence and lynchings and police brutality and the use of confessions to convict and execute Black people in Southern courts. But this wasn't supposed to happen. The federal government could have and should have protected Black people from racial violence that we were experiencing in the South. That was the purpose of the creation of the U.S. Justice Department. The Justice Department was created in 1870, and one of the goals was to help the federal government to go after the Klan, which terrorized Black people all across the South. Amos Ackerman, the first Attorney General of the newly created department, said that he would use criminal statutes that Congress passed in the post-Civil War era to go after the Klan. Those laws were Section 51 and 52 of the Enforcement Act passed in 1870. Section 51 created penalties for conspiring to deprive someone of their federal rights, and Section 52 prohibited those who claimed to be authorized by the law from depriving citizens of their rights. That included police officers and law enforcement. The Justice Department used these laws to prosecute Klan members. In 1871 in South Carolina, the department used Section 52 to go after Klan members who attacked Black people in 9 counties. 1,200 Klan members were prosecuted under Section 52, and all were convicted. The department also successfully prosecuted Klan members in Mississippi as well, between the years of 1872 and 1875. But after those prosecutions, the department and the federal government abandoned Black people. Sections 51 and 52 were no longer used until almost a half-century later. I talked about this abandonment in another video about Laura Nelson, so check that video out if you want a more full explanation on why this happened. During the time that the federal government refused to intervene and protect Black people from racial violence and injustice in the South, thousands of Black people were terrorized, and thousands of Black people were lynched. Thousands of Black people were humiliated and subjected to unspeakable conditions, and countless more lived a daily life knowing that there was nothing they could do to escape the fact that their skin color meant that they were not deserving of justice or dignity. The NAACP was waging a war in the courts and in the public on behalf of Black people at this time. And it was also asking the Department of Justice to use Sections 51 and 52 to protect Black people who were being terrorized in the South. In 1933 in Alabama, 18-year-old Dan Pippin Jr. and 15-year-old A.T. Hardin and another Black youth named Elmore Clark were accused of taking the life of a white woman. A mob took them when they were being moved between cities and lynched Dan and A.T. It was a horrific lynching. The Alabama grand jury refused to hold anyone accountable. NAACP attorney Charles Hamilton Houston implored the Justice Department to get involved and to use Sections 51 and 52 to prosecute the lynchers. Houston even submitted a 50-page legal brief explaining that if the U.S. did not get involved, then it was a hypocrite for speaking out against what Germany was doing at the time, but not doing anything about what was occurring within its own borders. Attorney General Homer Cummings was unmoved and rejected those arguments. The Justice Department did absolutely nothing. And then something changed. In 1939, with the support of President Franklin Roosevelt, Attorney General Frank Murphy created the Civil Liberties Unit within the Justice Department. In announcing its creation, Attorney General Murphy gave a radio address in which he stated that the federal government would pursue the goal of safeguarding the rights and civil liberties of all U.S. citizens, no matter their race, religion, or economic status. The Justice Department planned to use old laws passed during the post-Civil War era that had been forgotten to invoke its authority to investigate and prosecute the Jim Crow law enforcement who were violating the rights of black people. After a half-century of leaving them on the shelves, the Justice Department intended to use sections 51 and 52 to prosecute those who violated black citizens' rights. One of the first cases it took was that of a black teen named Quintar South. Quintar South was born on February 12, 1924 in Atlanta, Georgia, to James and Rosa South. His father worked as a painter and his mother was a washerwoman. He was one of 6 children. He lived his life as a regular black child in Atlanta. That was until 1940 when Jim Crow came literally knocking at his door. On February 26, 1940 at 11:30 p.m., 4 Atlanta police officers came to the home of Rosa South and arrested her 16-year-old son, Quintar. They said that he was wanted for a burglary. Quintar and 4 other black teens were arrested on suspicion of committing a burglary at the gym at Clark Atlanta University. 2 days later, on February 28th, Quintar and 2 other black teens, 18-year-old John Biggs and 16-year-old Alfonso Jameson, were brought by detectives William Sutherland and M.R. Dodd to the fingerprint room at the police headquarters. Quintar said that Sutherland then took him to a small room next to that one where the photographs were developed, and that's when the torture started. Quintar said that Sutherland slapped him in the face. He then punched 16-year-old Quintar in the stomach. He told Quintar that he was the one that was responsible for the burglary and he needed to confess to the crime. Quintar refused to confess and said that he did not do it. Even though he was being beaten by this man who was much bigger than he was, Quintar refused to confess to a crime that he did not commit. After beating Quintar for the first time, Sutherland took Quintar out of the room. Quintar heard Alfonso and John being brought into the room next to where he was. Quintar could hear them being beaten through the walls. It was after this that Sutherland escalated his brutality. He then came back and got Quintar and took him back to the photograph room again. He told Quintar to put his finger under a paper cutter. Sutherland then said that he had a better idea. He picked up an electric iron and plugged it into the wall. He waited 5 minutes for it to get hot. He tested it with a towel to make sure that it was hot enough for him. He then burned Quintar's arm with the iron. After he burned Quintar, he asked him if he was going to tell the truth about what happened. Quintar refused to make a false confession, so Sutherland burned him once again, this time on his elbow. He asked Quintar to admit to the robbery again. When Quintar refused, he burned him on his neck and his throat. The iron reached a temperature of over 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Quintar couldn't take it anymore. Quintar told him that he'd confess if he stopped burning him. He signed the false confession. Can you imagine the fear that Quintar South was feeling? It's one thing to be threatened with violence, but it's another to actually be burned. Sutherland didn't burn Alfonso and John, but he did beat them. They refused to confess, and Sutherland kept beating them until they too could not take it anymore and told Sutherland what he wanted to hear. They confessed to something that they didn't do, just to stop the beating. They also heard Quintar being burned and screaming in agonizing pain through the walls. And they saw his wounds when he was brought out of the room by Sutherland. These boys experienced something out of a medieval horror book. This is a photo from the FBI file of the tacking iron that Sutherland used to burn Quintar. This is the iron that reached 500 degrees that Sutherland used to burn Quintar on his arm and on his throat and on his neck. Take a look at Quintar. Look at the brutality he suffered. Look at what was done to this black child. This is what Jim Crow did to black children. Black children's youth was not an escape for them. Jim Crow demanded the same pound of flesh from black youth that it did from black adults. Quintar worked for a white woman named Mrs. C.E. Harrison. She was the wife of a prominent telephone company executive. She learned that Quintar had been arrested for breaking into the gym. This did not sound like the Quintar that she knew, so she decided to look into this incident herself. Mrs. Harrison spoke to a coach at Clark Atlanta University named Ralph Robinson. After speaking with him and learning more about what occurred, she became convinced that Quintar had nothing to do with the gym break-in. She then went to the juvenile facility that Quintar was being held at and spoke to him. She saw the raw and open burn wounds on his arm and on his neck. She thought he had done something to hurt himself and asked him what had he done. That's when Quintar told her what happened. He said that they hurt him at the police station. She listened to him as he recounted the horrors of what the police did to him. He told her how he was burned and beaten. She listened in shock as he told her how the police burned him until he gave a false confession, admitting to helping to break into the gym, and only when he told them what they wanted to hear did they stop burning him. After hearing this, she was horrified and wanted to do something. She brought his case to the attention of the public and the press. The Atlanta Constitution sent reporter Harold Martin and a photographer to talk to Quintar at the juvenile center. Quintar told the men what happened to him and how he was tortured and burned. Martin was able to convince juvenile judge Garland Watkins to allow him to take Quintar from the juvenile center to the police station with a juvenile probation officer. Judge Watkins was horrified with what occurred. He said that if Quintar's story was true, that there was never a more shameful thing that happened in Atlanta. He called what the officers were accused of medieval torture and said that they should be punished to the fullest extent of the law. Once at the police station, Quintar showed them where he was tortured, and when he saw Detective Sutherland at the station, he quickly pointed him out and said that he was the one that tortured and burned him. The Atlanta Constitution ran a story detailing Quintar's torture and beating. Quintar's case garnered a lot of attention from white organizations in Atlanta that all called for an investigation. The mayor at the time, William B. Hartsfield, said that he would not rest until the torture methods used by the Atlanta police were put to a stop. One day after Quintar's case was made public in the news, William Sutherland was indicted by the Fulton County Grand Jury for what he did to Quintar South. He was also temporarily suspended from the police department. On June 20th, 1940, 3 months after he tortured and burned Quintar, William Sutherland was tried in a Fulton County criminal court. Quintar testified and told the jury what happened to him. The other teens also testified and told what happened to them. Sutherland testified and said that it was all a lie and that it never happened. Numerous police officers testified and backed him up. At the end of the one-day trial, the all-white jury found Sutherland not guilty of all charges. However, this was not the end of Quintar's case. Remember, I told you that the U.S. Justice Department had decided that it was going to prosecute sheriffs and law enforcement that abused citizens' rights under the newly created Civil Liberties Section. The U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, Lawrence Camp, thought that this was a perfect case to test the civil rights statutes of the Reconstruction era. As soon as the news of what happened to Quintar was reported, the Justice Department ordered that the FBI investigate the case. The FBI secured the iron that was used to burn Quintar and had it tested to determine its temperature. The FBI also spoke to Quintar and his family members and people that he had interacted with after he was taken to the Juvenile Detention Center in Atlanta. The FBI also talked to Detective Sutherland and other police officers. Every single police officer that the FBI spoke to denied that Quintar had been tortured or burned. On March 16, 1940, Director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, forwarded their investigative file to the Justice Department for prosecution. The prosecution of William Sutherland was the first in a series of investigations brought by the federal government into police officers and sheriffs who were abusing the rights of black people in the 1940s and 1950s. Sutherland was federally charged with violating Quintar's civil rights. He was charged under Section 52 of the Enforcement Act. If convicted, he faced a $7,000 fine and up to 12 years in federal prison. He pleaded not guilty. The trial started in February of 1941. The case was tried before a federal judge, Emory Underwood, who ruled that if Sutherland's conduct was proven, it violated Section 52. Not surprisingly, the jury was all white. Quintar testified and told the jury what Sutherland did to him. He told the jury how he was tortured. The jury was presented with evidence of his injuries. Alfonso Jameson and John Biggs also testified about what happened to them and what they observed. Quintar's mother, Rosa South, she told the jury how the police came to get Quintar and that he did not have any of those injuries before he left her house. Other witnesses also testified, including the juvenile probation officer, the reporter, Mrs. C.E. Harrison, and others who all testified that they saw Quintar's visible wounds when he was in custody. Ralph Robinson, the coach from Clark Atlanta University, he also testified. He told the jury that he gave Quintar a sweater that the police charged Quintar with stealing. Sutherland exercised his constitutional right not to testify and did not take the witness stand. Instead, he had other officers talk about how good of a person he was. The Atlanta Police Chief, M.A. Hornsby, he testified about Sutherland's good reputation. Other police officers came forward and testified that they did not believe that the iron was used on Quintar and that the iron was not capable of causing those injuries. As far as they were concerned, Quintar was lying and it never happened. On the 5th day of trial, the weapon was tested in front of the jury. The iron was plugged in and allowed to get hot for 10 minutes. One of the witnesses for Sutherland, a detective named J.E. Helms, had testified that he did not think the iron could get hot enough to burn someone. Once the iron was hot, Helms rubbed the iron back and forth over his arm, and you could see his arm turning red, and it left a mark. The jury members were also given the opportunity to test the iron to see for themselves exactly how dangerously hot that it could get. This should have ended any doubt that the iron was used to burn Quintar, and that Quintar and the other teens were telling the truth. Despite the overwhelming evidence against Sutherland, the all-white jury could not agree on a verdict, and a mistrial was declared. In November of 1941, Sutherland was tried a second time in federal court. The second trial ended the same as the first, with a mistrial. The Justice Department decided not to try him a third time. He was never held accountable for what he did to Quintar South or the other teens. Quintar was drafted into the Navy and served in World War II in the Pacific. This is a copy of his draft card. He served in the Navy for 22 years until he was honorably discharged in 1964. We don't know much about what happened to his life after that. From public records, he got married in 1958 and lived in Virginia for the rest of his life. He died in 1988 at the age of 64. Quintar's case is very important. It was the first time in a half century that the Justice Department used the laws as they were designed to help black people. And Quintar's case became a model for how to investigate and prosecute sheriffs and law enforcement that violated black people's rights. What Quintar South went through in 1940, black people are still suffering today, being treated differently in our justice system. I wish I could say the times have changed, but that simply would not be the truth. Injustice is still alive and well when it comes to black people. Black people are still having their rights violated, and no one is doing anything about it. I want to know your thoughts on this video. Had you ever heard of Quintar South, and how did it make you feel learning all that he went through? Leave me a comment and let me know what you think.